Support comes from the St. Louis Chamber Chorus. Season 68 concludes at John Burroughs at 3 p.m. on May 26th with the United Nations commissioned Voices of Today by composer Benjamin Britten, featuring youth and adult singers. Tickets at chamberchorus.org.
This is St. Louis on the Air from St. Louis Public Radio.
I'm Alex Hoyer. A sobering anniversary is approaching this summer. It'll be 10 years since Michael Brown Jr., an unarmed black 18-year-old, was shot and killed by Darren Wilson, a white Ferguson police officer. The moment ignited a movement that ripped open long-simmering tensions between police and African-American communities, especially in St. Louis and North St. Louis County. While the U.S. Department of Justice concluded that police officer Darren Wilson acted in self-defense, it did find that the Ferguson Police Department had, on many occasions, violated the constitutional rights of its citizens and acted with racial bias. And while St. Louis County Prosecutor Wesley Bell declined to bring charges after reinvestigating the case, Bell said, quote, "There are so many points at which Darren Wilson could have handled the situation differently, and if he had, Michael Brown might still be alive." End quote. Bakari Sellers is the author of a new book that examines national politics and policies that deeply impact black people around the country. The former South Carolina state lawmaker is a civil rights attorney and CNN political commentator. He was in town recently to discuss that new book, The Moment, thoughts on the race reckoning that wasn't and how we all can move forward now. He talked with STLPR's race, identity, and culture reporter Andrea Henderson. They started the conversation by talking about the 2020 murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis. Here's Andrea.
In your book, you spoke about the day you were asked to talk about the killing of George Floyd on national television and how emotional you were right before and during the interview. Can you recall the day you found out about Michael Brown Jr.'s death? And what are your thoughts, or what were your thoughts before or during any interviews? And do you remember what was actually going on right during that time?
So Michael Brown was different for me. It was different because I was in a different place in my life. I believe it was 2010, if I'm not mistaken.
2014.
14. Mm-hmm. Man.
I know, it's so many of them.
No, it's so many of them. That's the problem. Could have been Alton Sterling, could have been, the list goes on and on. But in 2014, I was still in a different place in my life because of the fact that I was in the legislature in South Carolina. And so my daily task was all-consuming. Not only that, but I wasn't a father yet either. And so when these things happen and you're a father, as the kids say, it hits differently. And so I saw for the first time, my friends like Brittany Packnett, Cunningham now. She's a Cunningham now. I saw them in the streets. And it was for the first time that I saw young people really take back their destiny and kind of take control and take power of a situation. And that situation was Ferguson. And it was different than George Floyd for a number of reasons. But I don't think you could have had the response to George Floyd if you did not first have the response to Michael Brown.
And what makes you say that things were different? Was it just because things were on a mass scale then? I know more people showed up to protest for George Floyd. Why would you say things were different for George Floyd versus Michael Brown Jr.'s death?
So there were a couple of things. I think the first thing is Danella Frazier. She was the young 17-year-old girl who had the audacity to film. It was the words of George echoing out for his mother, calling for his mother, a grown black man calling for his mother. It was the situation and the context whereby you have that imagery of a knee on the neck and just violently for 9 minutes losing your breath until you die. And then last but not least, people don't take this into account, but COVID. COVID is one of the largest reasons that the response to George Floyd was what it was, because people couldn't turn away. Like, you had to stare at the screen. You had to watch this over and over again because there was nowhere to go. And people were looking for things to do, and so they came out into the streets. And so COVID played a huge role. And you saw the protests that were more diverse than what they were in Ferguson. A lot of that had to do with the city it was in. It was in Minneapolis versus Ferguson. A lot of that had to do with leadership at the time. And but again, you have to realize that Michael Brown did not die in vain, because if we did not learn those lessons, if we did not take back that power in 2014, then I'm not sure we would have been able to do the same in 2020.
Yeah. I know that you were in office from 2006 up until 2014, right?
Yes.
Okay, so take us back during that time. I know August 2014 was around near the end of your South Carolina House of Representative term. What was going on in Congress around that time of the Ferguson uprisings? Do you remember people talking about it? Were they trying to fast track any bills?
No. You didn't have the level of activism around Ferguson that you had around Minneapolis, for whatever reason that was. But you saw the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. You didn't see anything about Michael Brown. What we did learn, though, was the tactics that they would use, which is the first thing they did was bastardize Michael Brown. And he was dead, and they did not allow him to rest in peace. Instead of talking about him being murdered, they talked about who he was and what he was doing, etc. And, we, unfortunately, young folk have had to learn a lot about death and black blood flowing through the streets, from Emmett all the way through to George, and including Michael Brown. And it's unfortunate that after you're murdered at the hands of police, you're persecuted again.
I know many people thought after Mike Brown's death that we would see this reckoning for federal police reform. Did you think that would happen? And did you feel like we were on a cusp of change for the black community?
Not after Michael Brown, no. I did believe we were on the cusp for change after George Floyd. I thought we were on the cusp of a third Reconstruction, and we missed that as well. But not after Michael Brown. There was no impetus to move. There was no groundswell to change. This was another black boy who shouldn't have been doing what he was doing, and so the police, who are almighty, did what they were supposed to do and kill him. And he deserved the death penalty right there. And that's what you saw. That's unfortunate, because I think that there should have been a greater response to Michael Brown's death. And I think that if we would have responded appropriately, if the Missouri State Legislature or the federal government would have responded appropriately, maybe you wouldn't have had George Floyd.
What types of things do you feel like they should have done, whether it was the Missouri legislative or the federal government?
I mean, there are a lot of things in my book. I outlined some of the things you can do along the lines of policing, banning chokeholds, banning no-knock warrants between 12 and 6 p.m., a database for bad officers, so no longer can you get fired from the Clayton Police Department and go down and work in the St. Louis or Ferguson Police Department, a database of bad actors. I think officers need psychological examinations. It's a very tough job. And so there are a lot of things that we can do and a lot of things that should have been done. And the problem is that those things still have not been done on a large scale.
So let's go back to your book. So in your new book, The Moment, Thoughts on the Race Reckoning That Wasn't and How We All Can Move Forward Now. You talk about the race reckoning, like you just mentioned, which many believe happened in 2020 because of George Floyd's murder. But at first you thought it did happen, but then it didn't. Tell me.
No, I thought it would happen, but it never materialized. I thought we were on the precipice, I think, of it happening. And we just never dealt with the issue of race with any substance. We never, we got these $1,800 checks and then we turned the page. I wanted us to have conversations about systems of injustice and systems of inequity. And that's just not something that we did.
Let's kind of go back to Ferguson for a little bit. So after Ferguson protests, many folks thought police reform legislation would naturally occur. In Missouri and the St. Louis area, it did in some ways. We saw elections of local and state officials and lawmakers. However, police reforms have kind of stalled, and the election of black lawmakers and officials never really translated into true reform. Why do you see that? And we're seeing that on a national level, too.
Oh, it's follow through. It's a difficult task to change the way that we've been policing in this country. First, we have to reframe our thought. There are a lot of people who want to articulate that the criminal justice system is broken, and it's not. Systems in this country are broken. They work as intended. Engineers design systems to work as they work, so you cannot be surprised by the outcome. We have to deconstruct those systems and reimagine them so that they, look like us. And it takes people like those individuals who won those races, those district attorneys, those local mayors, it takes Mayor Jones and many others to be within these systems and try to, peel back the layers of decades of challenges to African Americans, and it's hard to do that in 4 years. I mean, it's hard to do that in 8 years. You listeners have to fully understand that when we have discussions about race in this country, black folk did not become full citizens, and the United States of America didn't become a true democracy or a representative democracy until the mid-1960s. So we're talking about 60 years whereby African Americans have had full citizenship in this country compared to others. That means we're running a race from behind. When you don't have access to the same schools, libraries, water fountains, restaurants, etc., and you don't have access to the franchise or to the ballot box, you're literally running from behind. And so what I'm trying to do in this book and what other elected officials are trying to do post-Ferguson is the same thing. We're trying to play catch up. And usually, you know how you sprint, like you're running after something and you just, it looks a mess out there. You're sweating and you're tired, and sometimes you got to take a break. But then you have to keep running a full sprint because we're about 220 years behind.
So what can the people do, especially whether it's black folks, whether it's white folks, brown folks, what can the people do?
Well, the first thing you have to do, and the reason I wrote the book, is to get off the sideline, because so many people are exhausted. So many people are tired. Politics today, local, state, federal politics is like watching a car crash. And so, I want people to think about ways in which we can change the world together. Nobody's going to be able to do this by themselves. And so we oftentimes do a great job of identifying problems, but very rarely do we identify solutions. And I want us to be solution oriented going forward.
At the end of the book, you talked about the untapped power of the black man.
Correct.
To talk more about that.
Yeah, in my last book, My Vanishing Country, I wrote and dedicated a large portion of that book to black women. And rightfully so, kind of giving them their flowers while they're living is what we say in the South. And they are the backbone of the Democratic Party, the organizers, the backbone of family, etc. But I also wanted to talk about, in this book, black men, because they're the second largest demographic of voters for the Democratic Party. And for a long period of time, they haven't been listened to. They haven't been thought about. There has not been legislation to deal with the issues of great concern for them. And we have to take a holistic approach to the way that we approach and talk to black men and listen to them. And it's more than just criminal justice reform, that black men want to hear more than that. And so for me, that is the conversation that has to be had, and we have to meet them where they are.
Yeah, and that's going to, like you said, the barbershops, going to the local rec centers.
Yeah, and, small businesses. And it's meeting them at their kitchen table where, they try to provide, where they're trying to make ends meet, where, they're head of household and they don't want, Mitch McConnell and Mike Johnson making decisions for their wives and daughters. They rather make that as a family with their doctor. It's all of these things that tie into what it means to be a black man in masculinity.
Cory Booker, who is the New Jersey Democratic congressman, and Tim Scott, who's the South Carolina Republican congressman, tried proposing police reform legislation, but it died in 2021. What do you think needs to happen on both the left and the right to be able to bring about this federal police reform that
unfortunately, it's dead. I mean, I actually sat in a room with Ben Crump. I sat in a room with the families of victims of police violence. Eric Garner's mom, Thelonious Floyd, was there. Terrence Crutcher's people were there. And Tim Scott was there, and so was Lindsey Graham. And, we even just tried to codify what Donald Trump did on criminal justice, and they refused to. There is an unwillingness to do, the police unions won, and there's an unwillingness to do what's right by the people of this country, and that's unfortunate.
So where does that leave the people?
Having to utilize our voice, elect better people to Congress, start over, try again, but keep pushing.
That does not give me hope. That does not give me hope.
Yeah, I didn't come in here with roses.
All right, so the city of Ferguson entered a consent decree in 2016. Although this measure is in place, there are still instances of racial profiling and disparities in Ferguson as well as in the St. Louis area. The Missouri Attorney General puts out a vehicle stop report. Mm-hmm. The Attorney General has been putting it out for over 20 years now. And over the years, it reflects that black drivers are more likely to be stopped and arrested than white drivers. and they kind of go into the weeds of being stopped and arrested, being pulled over, searched and detained. But mainly, more likely, black folks are more likely to be stopped and arrested than white drivers. And like many other municipalities in the area, some Ferguson drivers have not felt any relief from discriminatory practices. Why do we still see some of these systemic and institutional racism play out, even though there are these criminal justice policies and procedures that are in place to try to protect people, especially black people?
I mean, why don't things change is your question. And not only do we have to have the policies, but we have to have people who are willing to implement those policies. And here in Missouri, you have elected officials who could care less about what happens in St. Louis County because y'all are black folk. And so it's hard to get that level of accountability. And so that's what makes the DA's job so tough. And that's what makes Tashar's job so tough. And that's what makes all of our local elected officials who look like us. And what we have to do is rise above moments of bickering amongst ourselves and be willing to bring the relief necessary and the accountability necessary, something that hasn't been brought to this area.
So there are too many, like we discussed earlier, there are too many black people that have been killed by the police in the past few years to even remember every name, every year, every instance. One would think that over the years of continued police brutality toward black people that happen to be captured on social media, that black people will feel some type of reprieve from police brutality. But we just haven't seen it yet. Why do we still have these moments, like you talk about in the book, where black people just keep getting killed and then nothing happens? No police accountability, no prison time, no laws.
Well, we have one level of accountability. That was only in George Floyd, but it took so much for us to get that accountability. The price is really high to get accountability. We just haven't fundamentally done anything to change the value of black lives in this country. And so when you don't see the humanity in individuals, when you're able to see them as less than, you're able to treat them anyway. And, you know, black folk in a lot of people's eyes are treated as less than human. And we don't get the benefit of our humanity. Therefore, when we're on the side of the road, we're deemed to be either, you know, hyper-criminalized, violent, whatever it may be. And many times we're just trying to get home.
You talk about this in your book a little bit about how there were these commitments to black communities from every institution you can think of. But unfortunately, now the black community is seeing some blowback, some backlash, which you call white lash in the book. There are a great number of book bans. We have affirmative action being struck down, voter suppression. Your father, Cleveland Sellers, who co-founded the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, says things are getting worse as they were in the 1960s. How do you see things today?
My dad says that we're back in 1954, which is a sobering, it's a sobering thought. As somebody who's seen so much, you know, just in 1968, my dad lived through the Orangeburg Massacre in February. He lived through the death of King, his friend, in April. He lived through the death of RFK in June. And Vietnam was raging on, and the country seemed to be on fire. And so for him to say that we're back prior to 1954 is a sobering reflection. I, though, kind of refuse to acknowledge that because I look at people like Jimmy Lee Jackson and Henry Smith and Samuel Hammond and Delano Middleton and Emmett Till and Medgar Evers and all of those individuals who gave what Abraham Lincoln called the last full measure of devotion, or who, you know, slept on jailhouse floors like Congressman Clyburn and many others. I look at their sacrifices, and even my dad, and want to make sure they know their work wasn't in vain.
Mm-hmm. So is that how you find hope?
Yeah, I find hope. I mean, we're in a nadir. We're in the darkest period of time right now, but only when it's darkest can you see the stars. And so I find hope in this new generation. I find hope in my children. It's hard, but you have to be willing to cling on to some hope.
Yeah, and speaking about the hope in this new generation, we are seeing young people rising up. Right now, many students are protesting on college campuses across the country, including some here in St. Louis, for colleges to divest from companies that support Israel. I know you stated on October 7th that you condemn the Hamas attacks and you support Israel. Given what has occurred over the past 7 months, have your opinions and thoughts changed?
I think it's a very complicated and nuanced issue. I mean, I think that, you know, It's not whether or not you're pro-Israel or pro-Palestinian. What it is you got to be pro-peace, right? And you have to look at what happened on October 7th and acknowledge that that was one of the most violent and brutal days we've ever seen in our lives. And we have to acknowledge that that we need to make sure those hostages are returned safely, right? So that's first. The other thing is you can also say that the response from Israel was disproportionate and that we don't want any more innocent women, children, food service workers, hospitals blown up. We don't want any more of that because that response has been disproportionate and there have been too many innocent lives lost. You can also acknowledge that just as Bibi Netanyahu is a fundamental impediment to peace, who has adopted these kind of strictly conservative MAGA ways, even in Israel, that it's very hard to negotiate with the people who don't believe you have the right to exist in Hamas. And so I don't like having conversations where people say, when I bring up Hamas, they say Hamas, but you need to recognize what's happening here. No, we need to have a conversation about how we create an atmosphere, an environment where Palestinian children can grow, can live full and healthy lives, and where Jews in Israel can live free, safe, and secure, and have that right to defend themselves as a sovereign country.
That's former South Carolina state lawmaker Bakari Sellers talking with STLPR's Andrea Henderson. Sellers, who is also a civil rights attorney, is the author of the new book, The Moment: Thoughts on the Race Reckoning That Wasn't and How We All Can Move Forward Now. This interview was produced by Andrea Henderson.
Our executive producer is Alex Hoyer.
St. Louis on the Air is a production of St. Louis Public Radio. Understanding starts here. St. Louis Public Radio is a member-supported service of the University of Missouri St. Louis.
The Gateway brings you the day's news from the St. Louis region and across Missouri. It also includes stories from the Illinois side of the river and our Metro East reporter, Will Bauer.
In Alton, in Belleville, in East St. Louis, in Edwardsville, in Cahokia Heights, at Scott Air Force Base, I'm Will Bauer. St. Louis Public Radio.
Listen to reports from Will and all of our journalists weekdays on the Gateway, on the STLPR app, and wherever you get podcasts.